A little bit of a pivot. This is obviously not a round table. This is a very large rectangular room. So don't be shy. If you do have questions in the commentary, we could keep this somewhat interactive, even though it's a giant stage. A little bit about myself. My name is Don Holm, and I lead what's called the Value and Solutions Consulting Organization at a company called Medius. Medius is a company that's about 25 years old. We were founded in Sweden by the former CEO of a company, a manufacturing company, that saw an opportunity in his accounts payable process. There's inherent complexity. It was bogged down with exceptions. It caused a lot of supply chain friction and pain. And so he embarked to start a new company that was focused exclusively on solving the accounts payable problem. I've been at Medius about 3.5 years. Prior to that time, I spent the last 13 years at SAP, focused primarily on procurement and digital supply chain. And today we're going to be talking about, I guess, the convergence of cloud computing, artificial intelligence, and I think what it all means from a strategic opportunity perspective in AP. So we're going to talk about what AP sees that your business needs to know about spend. Before I get started, I want to level set a little bit around what predictive AI is actually delivering today. One of the advantages, I think, when you have a pretty robust and modern platform from an AP perspective is the ability to improve your point of view on cash flow forecasting, especially when you think about risk-weighted orientation of that, as you have invoices in various states of exception. You have a point of view on maybe how certain people tend to perform and respond from a cycle time perspective. So all of this information can fuel what is in effect a more accurate cash forecast. I think one of the more interesting case studies is this second one here. This is actually a Medius customer. We have a Fortune 500 customer that turned on an AI-based product within Medius called fraud and risk detection. And I thought when I first was meeting with them that the number on the screen was a typo, the $120 million. So what this company actually measures every single year, and they scrub out of their AP business process, is $120 million in cross-company duplicates that are essentially noise within their AP system. But if you think about it operationally, because they're not fraudulent, but they're duplicates, because they're scrubbed out in real time, they don't have people doing any kind of data entry to figure out a point of entry that it is in fact a duplicate. But what's interesting when I asked them the question is, why does this happen? And they said, what's interesting is because we're such a big company, our suppliers often share business across our different kind of vertical businesses. And they just shotgun blast invoices to any willing person they have inside of their customer master. And so the net impact is all these duplicates. Another example is identifying supplier consolidation opportunities. Just where is spend fragmented? One of the beautiful things we'll talk about in AP, especially when you have line level detail, is using AI to enrich that content so you have a really good point of view on where your spend is and where you have opportunities to maybe aggregate suppliers. And then probably another obvious use case for AI from a predictive standpoint is predictively coding and routing transactions like non-PO invoice transactions. So using AI to understand historical patterns of how non-PO invoices should be coded and of course routed to create a more touchless process. So anyway, let's get into a little bit of point of view on the maturity curve, and I'll kind of fly through this. Most organizations, I would say, are in the second box, which is they're focused on maybe automating AP. Let me poll the audience. How many of you would say you've done a good job, say, automating accounts payable, and you have a pretty touchless process? Show of hands. Okay, 3. The rest of you, 4. Okay. And then what about the rest of you? Pretty high touch, manual, what would you say? A lot of nods. Okay, perfect. As we think about then evolving through time and where you ultimately want to be, and this is something that we work on at Medius, is helping organizations shift from a pure task orientation to AP to that of more strategic supervision. So our version or our vision relative to artificial intelligence is to not necessarily completely take away the decision making, but in fact enhance or equip people with superpowers to make better decisions in a more timely basis. But enough of that. Let's get into some of the real strategic benefit of why it makes sense to automate accounts payable. So what you're seeing on the screen is data from an actual Medius customer relative to price variability for a given material over time. So if you're like most organizations today, you have some purchase order information, you have some non-PO invoice details, but most organizations are losing all of the line level detail that comes as part of that invoice document. You know, if it's a PO invoice, you're doing kind of the key entry, you're relying on the PO details. But that line level detail that you're getting on an invoice document, if you think about what that means and what that represents, that's actually the customer's either product master or service master content. And the advantage of having AI-based tools from an AP perspective is you can start to harvest all of that line level detail to make more strategic use of it, whether it be from a spend analytics perspective or what you're seeing here on the screen, the concept of purchase price variance or price drift. You can also see maybe how things like extraneous factors like tariffs or extraneous detailed charges are being passed along to you in the form of the invoice line detail. So what we're really talking about is a shift from being reactive to proactive. So in the classic sense, you know, you have a lot of hidden and uncontrolled spend, but really what we're trying to move towards is the idea of making that spend visible and controlled, okay? If you think about too, one of the things about AP, which is so unique, is all spend in an organization ultimately ends up in accounts payable. So if you're a manufacturer, you have your direct material spend, you have your direct material orders, all of that detail or all of those transactions end up in AP. From an indirect perspective, those transactions end up in AP. Services, all of that stuff ends up in AP. The question is, what do you do about it? So ultimately, most organizations are on a quest to drive more spend to what we call pre-approval, putting more spend under, say, a purchase requisition. Let me see a show of hands of organizations that feel you have great control, like upfront controls from a purchasing perspective for both, let's call it indirect spend. Couple hands. The rest of you, not so much. Any commentary? Yeah?
I would say, in my company, I put in centralized purchasing about 3 years ago. And that centralized purchasing found that we had areas that were using the exact same vendor, but we had multiple tiers of pricing for the same types of products. And we were able to align it to a single, really, vendor master, which then we renegotiated the total price of those products and the rest of the terms. Terms negotiation is an area that people forget about. And so in our locations, I think that people weren't really thinking what's the value of money, and so they would just agree to whatever terms the vendor had to basically give them. And that's never a great position to be in. So we went through a holistic view, and we did a reverse pyramid and said, let's take a look at the biggest vendors and the most amount of spend first, and then went through and ameliorated those contracts to basically be defined in a single sense and with the same terms and the same pricing across those same products. So that's been a big win for us, and it's been millions of dollars in improvement.
That's amazing. I mean, that is the story. And it's an interesting one, and I'm going to kind of play back some of that because I think it's such a great story. You essentially had decentralized purchasing with rogue units kind of doing their own thing, buying their own stuff. And what you find when you probably start to look at the data is people may be buying common things at different prices, different payment terms, and all these things. And that's really it. And if we go back to this idea of AP line level detail as the source of truth for where the money spends, and what you just described there is even just the simple Pareto analysis. Rank order, by, say, dollar amount, transaction counts, spend by category. Where do you have opportunities to aggregate that spend, to leverage the power of the amount of money that you're buying to essentially save money? And I think it's such a beautiful story. And that's really kind of what we're talking about. So line level insight powers that strategy. So if you look on the left, this is kind of a classic platform for indirect procurement where you're standing up content that is relevant to the things that people in the lines of business buy, so whether it be MRO equipment to support plants or plant maintenance items or materials or services, putting that content into a platform that is essentially centrally controlled, that is based on contracted pricing and rates, is kind of a proven way to drive real savings inside of an organization. So if we look at some of this stuff, right? So enable proactive spend control and supplier performance. Oops, let me go back. And really driving accurate and actionable insights into, again, things that your organization spends money on so you can ultimately save money. So if you think about the concept of AP, I was talking years ago with a huge oil and gas customer, and it was the first time I'd ever heard the concept that procurement and accounts payable are just one aspect of the same process. AP just happens to be at the back end. And it was interesting, this oil and gas company had organized on that process framework. So the AP people reported into essentially the same supply chain people. So it was all under kind of one centralized point of control. But the benefit and the impact when you have this holistic view of procurement and AP as a single process is you can start to get really, really strategic and really, I'd say, good at saving money for the organization, where you're connecting the invoice data, you're doing more robust spend analysis, it's driving sourcing and category management strategy, and ultimately resulting in better contracts and better supplier selections. One of the things that we talk about in Medius and we enable for our customers is the concept of, again, taking this line level detail, allowing customers to enrich it with artificial intelligence to understand both what are the categories of spend, where do you have a large amount of fragmentation, meaning you're buying spend across maybe multiple suppliers, where are your opportunities for consolidation, and making those insights real and actionable so that people, say, in sourcing can get a lot smarter about what the plan is for the upcoming year relative to, contracted, rates and driving those rates down, again, aggregating spend, all about, reducing cost. So, what do you need for rapid, effective negotiation? If we think about, and most of you are in finance, you probably don't think a whole lot about the processes, say, upstream for how spend happens. But from a best practice perspective, there's the concept of quick quoting. Quick quoting is the idea that if you have, say, a spot purchase, maybe it's an unusual amount, putting those quotes out for competitive bids at point of purchase is a great way to, get suppliers to sharpen the pencils, because the reality is, some suppliers at given times of the year are more desperate than others. So having a technology platform in place that allows you to quickly and digitally engage suppliers to gather, hey, what would it, what's your best price you can give me for this particular spot purchase? Great way to drive down costs for the business. Project-based sourcing, when we think about sourcing in the classic sense, this is probably more what you're used to. This is where you're maybe setting up a supplier for the first time, or you're running an RFP event and you're going through the rigmarole of trying to understand the capabilities of different suppliers and making a selection. One of the criteria is certainly price, but others might be, their ability to conform to your quality assurance, requirements, maybe proof of insurance. But that's project-based sourcing. That's something to, be good at if you don't have digital platforms in place. Supplier pre-qualification is also tied to the sourcing process. So having a business process that allows you to vet certain suppliers before you maybe move them on to, say, the actual pricing negotiations. One thing to be aware of, and I think this is important, especially as you think about price compression, this is a best practice from public sector. Public sector sourcing, this comes largely too from the federal government, has a requirement called public transparency, meaning any solicitation that goes out to a given vendor needs to be publicly available so that any vendor that maybe you're not aware of can see on your website the business opportunities available. So if you think about what that means from a private sector perspective, say you're running a sourcing event for stamped steel or some other thing, and you have a certain supplier that you always work with. By having a public transparency portal concept, you can push out certain bids so that other businesses inside the United States or other countries can see and actively, self-select to participate. The benefit for you in having this process is you, one, seamlessly create awareness over alternative sources of supply, and you also drive down prices, because when you have more people competing, you essentially are in a position to get better pricing. And then, of course, the bread and butter, I think, in this entire process is taking a sourcing event, being able to quickly create a contract, author that contract, go through the redlining process. You can compress the cycle time, and you have a much more efficient process. Goes without saying that having a great supplier experience is good too. So anyway, connect the dots with the contract process. The contract object is, I would say, probably the most important document when it comes to rate compliance and accounts payable governance. So again, when you think about holistically the ideal business process from a source to settle process, you've gone through the exercise to create the sourcing event, which has the embedded pricing. You push that awarded event into a contract. You have in that contract all of the rate items and things like that. You might push some of those contract items into your material master, so when MRP runs, those orders are being borne from the right rates. But ultimately, when the invoices come in, you need to be able to bounce those line level details and rates against the underlying contract document, thus ensuring that what you pay for is exactly what you negotiated up front in the process. So if we think about moving on to working with Medius agents to another huge value prop relative to artificial intelligence, and that is working capital optimization. So everyone today is running payments out of ERP, correct? Everyone's nodding, yep. So one of the problems with ERP is it's super deterministic, right? You have your vendor master, and typically your vendor master records have net 30 or net 45 payment terms. And then you have a batch payment process that's deterministic. You have a query that runs, we're going to run payment cycles on Monday and Friday or whatever it is. Maybe you run them 5 days a week, depending on the size of your business. And that query is going to run. It's deterministic. It's going to select those items for payment. The problem with it is it doesn't necessarily give you the opportunity to optimize, say, working capital in terms of holding on to your payments. You actually physically have to interact with the system. So one of the things that we have or are working on at Medius, we have it in one of our engineering environments, is using artificial intelligence to look out across the invoices that are approved and scheduled for payment, and inside of Medius Pay, having the ability to essentially optimize or run goal seek, where you can selectively hold on to certain payments to essentially keep that cash day, 2, 3, 4 days longer, depending upon your goals and objectives. So, and I don't know if I'm sure we're all finance people here, so we understand the concept. Holding on to your money longer essentially creates working capital in your bank account that you can use to fund other things. But it's a great use case for AI related to working capital optimization. If I recap some of the stuff we've talked about, every spend decision fully informed, end-to-end contracts all the way through invoices, payments, and expenses, having all of this spend detail in a single platform that uses AI to understand risks, patterns, provide analytics into details, spend aggregation in terms of, again, like we talked, supplier fragmentation, supplier categorization, all helps you be a lot smarter about strategic decisions related to spend. So the takeaway I would say for today is the shift isn't AI for AP. It's, again, using AP data in all of that line level as fuel for enterprise intelligence, because every single invoice and all those line details tells a distinct story. What you buy, what you pay, when payments land, and where spend drifts. And if you think about, the thousands of suppliers and all the pressure to maybe reshore some of the suppliers onto United States to minimize tariff impact, all of this is very important. Let me pause for any questions and just open it up for discussion. Thoughts? There's got to be something. I know you're taking notes. No?
I think I just want to say that I think it's refreshing to hear from a vendor that the shift isn't AI for AP and how you can leverage the data to drive your business.
Yeah.
It's quite refreshing to hear.
Yeah. If we think about AI, like when I think about it, yes, there's a process automation element, which is where we typically play at Medius. We are all about driving touchless and autonomy, and like I said earlier, moving from a task orientation to strategic supervision, and there's massive efficiency gains to be had from that. But it's fascinating when I sit down in a room with a CFO. What's so interesting to me, and I remember I was talking with the CFO, it was at, I think it was Briggs & Stratton, and just creating awareness around the things that you can do with data, and being in a position of power like a CFO, it gives you great freedom to task enterprising people inside of the business with initiatives that can actually move the needle. But it all starts with awareness, and the awareness comes from the data. Any other questions? Thoughts? It's got to be one more. Don't leave me hanging. We're not going to end on silence. One. Somebody. Yes. You're going to say something. No? Okay. Well, I guess we're going to end early. Oh, wait, there's a question. Oh, we have one.
So maybe talk about your experience with your customers in achieving optimal touchless rates, 90% plus. What sort of makes the difference to customers that are able to achieve optimal touchless rates with your solution versus maybe organizations that don't quite see that level of success?
Yeah, good question. So the question is, what is the difference between maybe customers that achieve higher levels of touchless relative to those that do not? The first and obvious, I think, part of it is the comfort level people have with automation and their willingness to relinquish controls, and at what point in the process, at what process points are they willing to relinquish controls? So if we think about the AP process and some of the touch points that happen, in our universe, there's the first step, which is invoice ingestion, like data capture. How well did the system extract both the header and the line level detail? So at that point, customers have a clear decision. Do you want to look and review every invoice, or do you want to enable, say, certain suppliers or all suppliers to touchless once you're comfortable with the system? So that's kind of one area. Customers, I'd say, of Medius become pretty comfortable with that process very quickly, so they will enable things for touchless. I'd say the next big determinant is whether or not the proportion of PO-based invoices. The beautiful thing about, I'd say, Medius from a PO invoice perspective is it is purpose-built to do complex matching. So I have a customer, for example, down in Los Angeles. They sell 100 million t-shirts a year. And they have basically 7 contract manufacturers distributed between China and India. And what happens is these contract manufacturers are basically trying to stuff and maximize shipping containers. And what that means is they'll have like an invoice that has 400 line items that's referencing 42 different purchase orders. And they just send that off to this customer. And so what happens in their business process in Medius is the data gets extracted, the header, and then all the line level details. And then inside of Medius Capture, there's a couple of technologies, both AI and some deterministic checking to make sure that it's accurate. But then it flows into the matching process where we're able to connect the invoice lines to the right PO line and then tee up just the exceptions. So that can drive a touch. So part of the touch can be the quality of the purchase order detail, and does that create a human touch? But the beautiful thing is if the PO data is accurate and it matches up the line, it's a completely automated transaction. The next thing I'd say is on the non-PO side, some people just aren't comfortable, or it takes them a while to get comfortable with the predictive coding and routing. And also sometimes it takes a while for the machine to learn. So if you have, for example, an invoice with 4 lines, a non-PO, it's going to take more passes to learn the codes and the routing when you have more lines to deal with. So that could be a factor too, is the complexity of the non-PO invoices and how that affects the touchless rate. And then the last thing is, I'd say, just comfort level. Some AP departments like to look at everything as a final stage of review before they push to the ERP. And it's all comfort level. But we have some customers that are like, you know what? If it's passed everything and it's approved, just push it in. So we see the average, I think, is like 65% touchless. Our best performing customers are right around 95, maybe just shy of 95%, which is pretty amazing. Any other questions? There's got to be one question. Nope. Okay. Well, I think that might be it. Thank you all for listening. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you,
Okay.
Don.
Thank you, Carla.
It was great.